Howdy folks, artist and writer shall Presto DiBaggio here. I'm hanging out with writer Magnificent Mike DiBaggio, who is also my husband, and Kickin' Kim Holm, a fellow artist. We're going to be talking about copyright from the creator's perspective. Warning, none of us are lawyers. And we'll be discussing ideas such as what if copyright existed when major religions were being founded? But before we get into it, I wanted to let you know that Mike and I are currently running a Kickstarter for an RPG zine chock full of ideas for you to throw at player characters in your current campaign. Do you need more supernatural foes, gruesome all-new spells, and tainted psychic horrors for your RPG campaign? Then please check out Dauntless, the heroic adventure zine on Kickstarter. Issue 1 features Kim's art as well as mine. Okay, let's dive into copyright discussion.
Okay, so with that out of the way, let's talk about the Creative Commons and the free as in Linux, not free as in beer aspect of your art. Yep. And I would like to read briefly, if you don't mind, from your Patreon page, where you say, you're describing yourself, you say, art should be free, not necessarily gratis, but free to spread, use, and make new art from. Like the fairy tales of old or folk music, art is at its heart a communal effort. It is a way of communication, not a commodity. I make art and release it under Creative Commons licenses so you can use it exactly as you see fit. As the copyright industry has tightened their grip on the internet, infringing on our privacy, our freedom of speech, and our human rights in the process, we as artists need to find new free ways of distributing our art that is in line with the nature of art itself. That is what I'm trying to do. And although I agree with you on that, and I think Shell does too, I would say that it's not much of a stretch to say that that's a very unusual belief for an artist. Very rarely do we encounter other artists that are okay in any sense with even like open sourcing their work, even on a limited basis, let alone being, as you said, you're actually out to abolish copyright. That's a very, very powerful statement. But so can you explain to the audience how you came to that position, and like where you're coming from there, because it's something that I think a lot of people will find very surprising.
Well, first of all, artists are people who, I'm sorry to say, generally don't think very deeply about copyright. Art is being pushed to the forefront of every new copyright legislation because copyright is always there to save art, to protect art. And that's sort of, I believe that's a scam that people, that artists have been, to some degree, just accepting, because there's no reason for us to think very deeply about it. At least, no apparent reason. I started thinking about copyright in the 90s, when I read how artists and writers like Frank Miller and Alan Moore were fighting to get Jack Kirby's original pages back to him, to get him the credit he deserved for creating basically the whole Marvel universe, which I think is pretty. Stan Lee did create stuff as well, but Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and those guys did the actual work, and they they created works as work for hire, and they lost all their rights to it, and I thought that was it was a shame. It was almost a criminal shame what Marvel and DC and other comic book companies did. So I started at that time thinking more and more deeply about copyright, yeah, and the importance of uh, artists having the rights themselves. And then I started perhaps thinking too deeply about it and thinking, wait, I still feel that it's better to have the rights yourself than to give them away to some corporation. But what are these rights we're having? How do we benefit from basically stopping people from sharing your art? Because that's what copyright is. It is a state mandated censorship, uh, inhibiting the spread of ideas and works of art. When I say ideas, I don't mean in the legal term. I mean that like Iron Man is an
Right.
idea,
Right.
and copyright. The theory behind why copyright uh, should the theory why it should incentivize the new creation of art, which is the whole reason why we have an intellectual property system, is to incentivize the new creation of art so that that art can eventually end up in the public domain. That if you go to the
Right.
American Constitution, if you go to the Berne Convention of 1883, it's specifically the reason why we have copyright laws is to incentivize the creation of new art. And I started thinking, how does it incentivize new art that I that my grandchildren will be able to sell my work 70 years after I'm dead? That didn't seem to fit. And then how does it actually benefit me that lawyers, or in extreme cases, the police, can stop people from copying my work? What are they doing? They're actually stopping the spreading of my name, my legacy, my everything.
Right.
And I started first. I started questioning, just the whole function of this. It was copyright laws absolutely do not work as they are intended to. Uh, and then I started questioning the economics of it, and I strongly believe that uh, our current copyright system is bad for most artists economically, because it sort of puts all it shifts the balance of power away from you as the creator and to the distributor, because
Right.
you're free to create something, but the distributor will only pay you the good money if they get the rights to it, if they get exclusive rights. So it's the main monetary gain in our current copyright system is when you give away the right to work on your own creation,
And that
and you can't. It's when you've invented this character and you're selling away the right to work on him or her ever again, and that doesn't quite make sense to me, and it shifts the balance so that distributors or production companies, as long as they own the rights, they are pretty much free to treat the creators as crap. Because,
I just wanted
yeah,
to say, speaking to what you're talking to, the Jack Kirby thing hasn't been remedied. You'll hear a lot of, Jack Kirby got short shrifted and everything like that. Well, Jack Kirby never got the rights back to his characters. The particular thing
yeah,
that you were talking about was literally getting him back the original pages he drew so that he could either keep them for himself or sell them for money, because he was
yeah.
no longer making money from Marvel. And to this day, Jack Kirby's family, or, Jack Kirby himself, has passed on. Stan Lee himself, his family, does not have any rights to deal with all those characters they created with. They are the sole property of Disney, who had nothing to do with Marvel when they were created. Those creations are being traded as commodities.
And specifically about the Jack Kirby case, the interesting thing there is that if Jack Kirby worked as work for hire, then the product he was selling was the finished printed drawings,
Right.
while the original pages was just a production element that was his.
Mm-hmm.
Marvel never bought the rights to the original pages.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem there is, and Marvel did give back, I don't know what it was, but it was a very small amount of pages.
Mm-hmm.
And the theory about why they couldn't give back more of the original pages was it would prove just how much work Jack Kirby did.
Mm-hmm.
And that would sort of topple the whole legend of how Stan Lee created the Marvel Universe. But yeah.
I think you really hit the nail on the head when you talked about the inversion of power, because when I talk to a lot of creators, and we say that all our stuff is released copyright free. We don't copyright it. It's Creative Commons, attribution, share alike, and we want people to use it. And anyway, I don't believe in copyright, and they often react with horror and they'll say, well, how are artists supposed to live? How are they supposed to pay their bills? And my response to that is, are you paying your bills right now? And 90% of the time is, well, no, we're not. I'm not paying it with my art. And I say, so maybe the copyright system that you're supporting here isn't working. And they people, a lot of people think, you live with something for a long time, and if you don't think about it very closely, as you did, that you think, well, I guess things have always been this way, and the only reason we have art is because of copyright. The only reason we have new inventions is because of patents and so forth. But the truth is, they're really an invention of the 1600s, at least in the English common law system, and they are. It was never. As you said about the moral rights of the creator, and I think the idea was that, well, we want to give the original impetus behind such laws was to give a temporary business monopoly to, and it wasn't just to everybody at that time either. It was to people closely connected to the crown, to the government, and then later on, as you go through the Enlightenment, we come with the idea, well, we want to do this not to give anyone a monopoly, even though that is de facto what it is, but we want to incentivize the creation of new works of art, and as you say, that will eventually enter the public domain, that will become free and ownerless and become part of the cultural heritage, and so you have the original copyright laws in the United States is for a period of a total period of 14 years, and there were specific like you had to specifically copyright it through the Copyright Office. You had to produce certain indica on the cover or wherever, and this persisted through through the 1970s in the United States, and over time the monopoly periods grew and grew. And to the point where you have now, whenever there's like the Sonny Bono Term Copyright Extension Act that basically put a halt on the public domain for 20 years, and that starting in January 1st, 2019, it finally expired. But that wasn't led by it wasn't
led by a small cabal of independent artists saying we need to worry about our rights. It was like people who are already hugely rich, and corporations like Disney.
There's a reason why they call them
people who are hugely rich from works they didn't create themselves.
Exactly. And colloquially, it was called the Mickey Mouse Protection Act. The actual you also you're probably aware of this, but if your listeners are not, then you have the very nice Mickey Mouse curve, which shows that every time Mickey Mouse is about to go into the public domain, copyright magically extends. Right.
Yeah.
And it's a very accurate curve so far.
And even right now, the copyright law favors corporations over people. The copyright term for something owned by a corporation is longer than a term for something creator created and creator owned.
In the United States right now, the term for a corporate owned work for hire is 90 years, whereas the term is it could be longer. Often, in many cases, it will be longer. But the other case is now it's currently new stuff after 1977. I guess is lifetime of the author plus 70 years, right? So if you're already 70, right, and you die, if the last thing you create it will be out in 70 years, but if you're working for Disney or Marvel or whoever, that's going to be there for well into the next, almost to the 22nd century. And the other thing that's really, I think, perverse about this, and Kim, you brought this up, is you've instead of creating a system that induces the creation of new art and rewards the artist, they've actually induced people to sell away their own creations so that they can't have control over them anymore. They can't even on their own for fun, theoretically under law, cannot produce drawings or new stories of their own characters once that they've sold. And even though this is entirely new stories that weren't there before, or new designs or whatever. And adding to that perversity is that companies like Disney, the bulk of their money comes from adaptations of public domain fairy tales. Whether you're talking about
Frozen, Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid,
Snow White.
I just want to have a couple of points here. One thing is that I absolutely love and adore companies like Disney. What they've done with copyright, with their work, whether it be own creations like Mickey Mouse or it would be Beauty and the Beast and Snow White, they have created some magnificent work that is on technical and artistic. It's in a league of their own. So I'm full of admiration for the effort that these companies are doing on an artistic level. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and the audience sort of gets to decide that. But one of the things that I again and again experience when I start talking about my views on copyright is this idea that I just don't like capitalism, which is true for me. I'm not a capitalism fan, but my argument against copyright isn't that I hate capitalism. It is that this isn't actually good capitalism. It isn't free market even. And one of my favorite quotes to pull on anyone I'm discussing this with is from Milton Friedman, who I generally don't agree with a lot of what he was saying, but when questioned about copyright, he said that copyright is the opposite of freedom of speech, which is kind of a amazing statement,
Right.
and it's true. And he wasn't advocating for the abolishment of copyright as I am. He was advocating for let's get copyright down to something more feasible, like 14 years after the creation of the work, not 70 years after death of the
Right.
creator. And I wouldn't mind copyright that much if it was 14 years after the creation of the work, because that would create this little mini monopoly where you have this period where you can super exploit your work, and that might actually incentivize the creation of new works. And then you have a little time where you can exploit it, and then it's free.
Mm-hmm.
And then
at least in that case, it would be manageable. It's something that people could deal with. As now you're saying, you're going to die, your children are going to die, and maybe your grandchildren are even going to die before they're able to actually use this stuff in the public domain. And that's really hard to deal with. Also from the perspective of the 1977 changes, which just made everything automatically copyrighted. There's no well-defined, legally tested way in the United States today to actually enter a work in public domain. It's not defined. And you don't have now you also don't have there's no tracking of orphan works. So there's all these works that are theoretically under copyright, but no one knows who the rights owner is. They're out of print. They're out of publication. No one even knows, and so we have books and we have artwork and poetry and all of this stuff that is floating out there that nobody can get access to. And that is a direct that's a direct assault on the intention of the law.
Yeah, and it's a direct consequence of how the law is shaped. Is that for companies, for a large corporation, there's no reason to try to exploit all the different copyrights they own that might not be as popular as they once were, or might not ever have been a hit or popular. And that's sort of there's still an incentive to stop other people from using it, because that's an opportunity to extort money for the work. And if the money isn't good, then there's really no reason for them to say yes, which in reality means that thousands upon thousands, probably millions of work are rotting away in corporate basements and will be lost before they get archived. And we're actually erasing artistic works that should have been in the public domain every single day. And it's a direct consequence of how these copyright laws work.
And we've actually run into that with other writers that we know, where they've to get a publisher, they've sold the rights to their book, and the idea is that the rights will expire after a certain term, usually like 7 years or more, and then it will revert back to them as long as the publisher feels like they don't want to print it anymore. But we've known situations where basically they made an initial print run. It didn't sell. The publisher said this isn't worth it for us, and therefore now that author can never get they have to wait years.
You usually have to wait 7 years to get their work back, and then they're like, oh, the 7th year is coming up. And sometimes they'll do things like they'll print 100 books and sell them in another country.
Right, just to keep the right to that, even though they don't want to do anything with it, and it's crazy that the law allows that and encourages it, as you said.
And the law actually, it's sort of has opened this huge. It's almost a grifter-like market where corporations with a lot of money are paying relatively small sums to young artists who are desperate.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're young and desperate, then in order to produce your book or to produce your albums, you can give away the rights. You don't really think that much longer beyond your next meal.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But for the corporation, it's a very small investment, and it makes sure that if that artist suddenly 20 years later makes a success with another project, then they can re-release whatever they own the rights to.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a small investment to scam the rights away from young artists who are too. I almost said too stupid, but it's not stupid. It's kind of.
It's a naivety.
But it's for a lot of artists. It is necessary. It's a necessary evil in order to get their art out there,
and also
they don't have to.
I was going to say, and also sometimes you just get food on the table.
Yeah, and it's fundamentally exploitative that will allow that to happen. And I think if you're worried about fostering the creation of new art, then that's something you should look at, because it seems to me that actually hurts the creation of new art. There's people who are turned away from ever doing anything because they can't make money on it. Part of the reason they can't make money of it is because the corporate domination of it, the way everything is geared towards the. Just to get away from art just for a second, there was some years ago, Courtney Love wrote an excellent article, and she's not usually an intellectual that I refer to, right? But she wrote this excellent article about what a scam the recording industry was. Because someone basically asked her, like, how do you feel about Napster? She's like, I don't care about Napster. Napster doesn't hurt me. The recording industry hurts me. And she went into wonderful detail how, you think, rock stars who are famous are rich, and a lot of them are not, because the way the RIAA is set up and all these record labels. They nickel and dime these artists for everything. They give them advances, and then they take it all back, and they have to pay like the concert tour and everything out of their own pockets. Then they end up may have a gold selling album and end up in debt to the record company, and that's something I think that most people who are knee-jerk defenders of copyright and how it protects artists have no idea what's really going on behind the scenes, and I really wish they would avail themselves of some of the information here.
And the music industry is really ripe with those type of stories, because the music industry has a lot of people that are sort of easy to exploit. Like I mentioned, Willie Nelson's. He sold the rights to Crazy for, I don't know if it was $50 or $200, but that's a million selling song, and it's not his. And and that's a very common type of story. But just to turn the time a bit back here, what I was originally saying was that this was the first aspect I started thinking about when I started questioning copyright back in around 99, 2000, 2001, someplace. And then when I realized that I couldn't release my stuff under copyright anymore, I had to do something else. I had nothing to I didn't know where to go. I didn't know about Creative Commons yet.
Mm-hmm.
I tried talking to union lawyers for the designer union in Norway, and they didn't understand what I was trying to do at all. And I basically just had to step out in the world and figure out how I was going to do this stuff. And gradually, I started meeting more and more people who were in other fields and who had other types of problems with copyright, like how copyright makes an artificial class divide between first world countries and third world countries when it comes to education. Because poor countries simply don't have the money to, even if they can print the books themselves, they're not allowed to use good educational books for kids
Mm-hmm.
unless they pay the copyright. Or I was contacted by what do you call it, a hospital librarian who talked about how medical journals are you have to pay a quite high rent to loan them out from a hospital library,
Mm-hmm.
which means that if you're at a rich hospital, then you have doctors who can go and read up on the latest medical procedures. But if you're at a poor hospital, then they're not allowed. They have the literature physically in the building, but they're not allowed to read it
Right.
unless they pay. So then I started realizing how this copyright stuff, which is to protect artists, of course, is actually endangering human progress and life, directly endangering life. And I started thinking, you know, that art sort of pales in comparison to that in
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
a weird way. And
No.
then, um, just a few months ago, of all things, I started reading because for me, you know, I completely understand that medical journals being open source or open access is more important than Batman being copyrighted. I understand that completely, and luckily, academics and doctors and people working in these fields have usually think about copyright a lot more deeply than artists do. And they have these discussions about open access journals, about open source, about Creative Commons. And even if they don't agree with me, they have at least thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, my head, it knows that people's lives are more important than being allowed to draw Batman.
Mm-hmm.
But my heart doesn't quite know that. And I started reading, of all things, I started reading the book Maps of Meaning by Jordan Peterson.
Mhm.
Who's a quite controversial figure these days, but I find him very entertaining. And his whole Maps of Meaning book is basically describing how um, it is describing how Jungian archetypes, um, you know, you know, these symbols that you find in all types of literature and art and stuff, how they are connected in a very real and very persuasive way to our basic perception, how we perceive the world, how we are when we start by getting launched into chaos, into something unknown, and then we have to sort of figure out our surroundings, and then we gain control, and then something new is added to this mix, and it's unknown, and it creates chaos, and we have to do this whole thing over again. So he linked all these archetypes to some of them to order, and some of them to chaos, and some of them to the perceiver who perceives and manages order and chaos. And it's a pretty good argument for parts of the book, I think. And then he goes into how, in his opinion, we get these stories about Buddha and about Jesus and about the individual ascending to godliness, and how these stories percolate in our culture for about 1500 years, 2000 years, and then in the Enlightenment they bubble up and they become our modern laws, which are supposed to respect each individual, and we all have inalienable rights, and that it was sort of, in his opinion, it was these types of stories working on our subconscious and our unconscious and on our conscious for 1500 years, and then bubbling up and becoming the world we now know.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started thinking, what if Buddha was copyrighted by DC and Marvel took Jesus,
Right.
and every time the Buddha and Jesus stories fell out of fashion, they did a reboot where they added extra pockets to Jesus' suit and some guns. And how would the world appear 1500 years later?
Mm-hmm.
And so my journey the last few months have been sort of getting back to my starting point, which is, for me, art is the most important.
Mm-hmm.
Art is what guides us as humans, what makes us human. And for the last 150 years, or you can take it longer, you can take it back to the Statute of Anne, you can take, but for the last 100 to 300 years, we have been messing with how we create art, how we create meaning. We've been taking our whole method of creating meaning in the world, and we've been placing it under this weird legal censorship system.
Right.
And I think that we're seeing some of the consequences of that now, but I dread to see whatever consequences we will find in 1500 years. That's I think I think our copyright laws are messing with something much deeper and more profound than we dare uh, think of in our worst nightmares. And and you can sort of see the effects of this quite early in copyright history, where we used to have folk music.
Mm-hmm.
We used to have folk art, but folk music wasn't killed by the recording industry. Folk music was killed by copyright, which makes it impossible to make any new folk music because you can't have folk ownership of art anymore. And if you can't collectively own the creation process, then you can't have living folk music anymore. Then folk music is just something for museums, something dead, which is recited as a ritual. And that can be good. Rituals are good.
I have to
But
say,
yeah,
I agree with you completely, and I have never heard it articulated as clearly as what you just said. And you're not going to get any arguments from me about like culture and art being actually the most important. Certainly,
just
you brought up the medical
just
journals. Yep, sorry, go
just
ahead.
imagine how clearly it would have been stated if I hadn't been in the mosh pit yesterday.
That too.
I mean, you mentioned like the Disney or DC owns Buddha and Marvel owns Jesus, but in real life, there's such a thing as like there's translations of the Bible that are copyrighted, and what does it and I say like what does that mean? Like, theoretically, yeah, that's perfectly legitimate under law because someone did a quote new translation of the the original the Septuagint or whatever or the Vulgate or something like that. But how can you? I mean I'm a Catholic and I can't imagine going before God at the end of my life and saying, I sued people over the Bible. I prevented your word from going out into the world with legal restrictions, and it staggers it's really staggering to think about that, but people just don't even think twice about it.
I think the thing about folk music too, a great example of that, because I like copyright and Creative Commons and public domain. For as much as we talk about, people signing their rights away, possibly stupidly or naively or just to get food on the table, they're actually really complex subjects that do require a good bit of studying to fully understand them. So to illustrate your point about folk music, they thought Happy Birthday was under copyright far longer than it was. Someone was claiming they had the copyright to it. But that's
I believe that case was only resolved last year. And it was resolved that Happy Birthday, the song, is in fact not copyrighted. So go ahead and sing it again.
Right. And, think about that. I've always sung Happy Birthday whenever there was a birthday so 35 years I've been singing Happy Birthday before something, but then you go to restaurants and they don't sing Happy Birthday because they don't have the rights to it. Like every restaurant has their little birthday song, or on TV when it's someone's birthday, they don't sing Happy Birthday because they have to pay for the rights for that. And it's like that's a cultural touchstone. Like everyone does that. That is its own form of ritual. And yet up until last year, you can't sing Happy Birthday,
on TV or radio. Yeah, it's really bad how, and I mean, of course, everyone does it in their own homes and so forth, and just like in this, and in the same way that almost everybody violates copyright laws all the time, whether they intend to or not, whether they understand what they're doing. I mean, theoretically, if you draw Spider-Man, even for yourself, right? There's no limitation in copyright law that says, well, you can do it for your own usage, even if you don't have to make money off it to violate the law. And you could argue, well, that's fair use, but fair use is an affirmative defense, and that's something that only appears in trials. So these are things that
You can't claim fair use before you're accused and brought to trial for something.
Yeah, exactly. Or like all the artists that we see at comic conventions, which I have absolutely no problem with, of course, because I'm on board with Kim and being for the abolition of copyright and for open source everything. But we see these artists that go out and they're selling pictures of Superman and Batman and Spider-Man and Deadpool, and
they drew.
That they drew, right?
Yeah,
and they're very protective over. Oh, hey, that guy's copying my stuff. Is like, but you don't have the legal right to sell what you do anyway. And all it will take is Walt Disney Corporation to get a bug up their butt and decide they're going to send lawyers to all the cons, and that'll be the end of you.
And we have examples of companies telling artists who have worked for them on comic book titles that they can't sell new original drawings at cons.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to say very carefully and specifically here that because I have these views on copyright, I don't do that. Let me. I don't want to lie about this. If I'm at a comic book con, which I was for a lot of years, I will draw Superman for kids. I will draw Spider-Man for kids.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're paying me, then I'm more and more. I'm saying no. Mm-hmm. I'm actually not allowed to do that under the current law, and I'm against the current law. But I don't want to break it. And I pay for the music I listen to. I pay for the movies I watch. I pay for. I try to do everything above the board, and not. I don't want anyone to be able to say that, oh, you just support piracy because you're a pirate.
Right.
But, I don't want to give them that satisfaction.
I agree.
So I try very hard to do everything by the book, and also in solidarity with my fellow artists, because even if the company is screwing them, they have allowed them. It's their will that this product is on that service. So yeah, I will pay for Spotify and Netflix and whatever. It doesn't bother me, and I don't pirate.
Farewell and adieu to you, fair Spanish ladies. Farewell and adieu to you, ladies of Spain. For we've received orders for to say